Record. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Associated Distinguished Professor of Integral and Transpersonal Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He earned an MS in Electrical Engineering and a PhD in Psychology from the University of Illinois. Before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He is author or co-author of hundreds of technical and popular articles, 4 book chapters, and 4 popular books, The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. Welcome to the show, Dean Radin.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on. I've been a fan of your work and excited to chat with you. You're up to some extraordinary things. You've done some extraordinary work. And I guess for those who are not familiar with you, I was wondering if you want to give them a little bit of background and then we can dive in wherever you want to start.
Well, my original career was intended to be a concert violinist. So from age 5 to about 25, I was primarily playing the violin hours a day. And about the last 10 years of that, I was doing professional gigs of various types. But sometime in college, I realized that it was possible to make a living doing something other than music. And so I asked around to my friends and my family's friends, what would you do if you wanted to continue music as a hobby, but not have to actually spend your career doing it? And of the various kinds of things that people suggested, engineering was one of the first. So I was interested in science and engineering as well, and I ended up getting 2 degrees in electrical engineering. And then I still don't know what I wanted to do. So I took a vocational inventory test in graduate school, which matches your personality against different kinds of professions. And the idea of that was that if your personality matches somebody who's happy in their profession, you're pretty likely going to be happy in this other profession too. So I took that test, and what it suggested was that there were 3 professions that I would be happy in. The first one was policeman. I can sort of understand why. I mean, I'm interested in social justice and that social order and that sort of thing. The second was priest. Well, I'm not a very religious person, so that wasn't going to work, but I understood that as well, because that is oftentimes about social justice as well. And the third was social scientist, or a scientist involved in studying human behavior. And so that made a lot of sense to me. So after I got my master's in electrical engineering, I went on to get a PhD in psychology. And so I have a mixture of various kinds of artistic and scientific background, none of which had anything to do with psychic phenomena. And yet, as I speak now, I spent the majority of my professional career doing science on psychic phenomena. So what's the connection? The connection is that when I was young, I read a lot of fairy tales and science fiction and was always curious about these experiences that people talk about. And when I was about 12 or 13 years old, I ran across a book that described how science can be used to study things like telepathy. And I found that just fascinating, because now the stories that I had read about as a child, I saw that there was a way to test if these were simply fantasy or whether it was actually true. And I never forgot that. So I started doing little experiments by myself. And then I continued doing that through graduate school, actually college and graduate school, and even when I started working at Bell Labs. And I was getting interesting results. And that just kept pushing my curiosity. And eventually I managed to gain full-time employment to do this kind of research. And that's what I've been doing now for over 40 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's interesting that you have the very strong science background, which is what we need, because a lot of the people studying, let's say, consciousness and spirituality now, they don't have that strong science background. So you've written some incredible books and you have the new one out now. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's in there, what some of the research and science that you've discovered?
I think I'll put it into context. So the four popular books that I've written now, the first one is called The Conscious Universe. It was describing how science can test psychic phenomena. And this, in order to be able to talk about that, you need to talk about what science is, how experiments work, what counts as evidence in science, and on and on and on, all kinds of things about that. So that's what that book is about, basically. The second book I wrote because one of the critiques that you often hear about psychic phenomena is from physicists who say that ESP is impossible. Well, then you say, well, why is it impossible? Because it violates the laws of physics. So the second book, called Entangled Minds, was to address that question and to see whether or not physics as we know it today actually makes ESP impossible or not. And it's a very clear answer. It is not impossible. It would have been impossible in the 17th century, but not today. So that was that book. It was addressing the physics question. The third book was to begin to answer the next question that often comes up, which is, well, then how does this work? How could it possibly work? So I decided to do an analysis of the Eastern esoteric traditions, because the esoteric traditions go all the way back to shamanism. So they're at least 10,000 years old, maybe longer. And there's a continuous strain of traditions that are shaped by culture and history that go all throughout the East and all throughout the West. So the first book is about the Eastern esoteric tradition, primarily in the form of yoga and meditation. That book was Supernormal. It's about the cities from yoga. And now my most recent book, which came out in April 2018, is on the Western esoteric traditions. In the Western esoteric traditions, the psychic phenomena are cast in terms of magic, esoteric magic, because both Eastern and Western esoteric traditions are saturated with practices. And the practices are what we would today call magic. They were even called magic back then. Magic had a different connotation then. Magic meant wisdom, essentially, a kind of power or wisdom, but it was a practice. Well, when the church came along and then later science came along, these traditions were suppressed. And so in today's secular scientific way of thinking, magic is an ancient superstition, and clearly none of it is real. That's what academics are taught. The problem with that is that when you actually look at what the underlying concepts of religion are based on, it's based on the notion that consciousness is fundamental in some way. This is true both in the Eastern and Western esoteric traditions. So in the Western sense, we're talking about long after shamanism, we have Pythagoras, Plato, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and of course leading to practices like alchemy, astrology, herbalism. More recent times, the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons were among the first groups to collect all of these ancient esoteric ideas. The Freemasons in particular were interesting because this was the first time that an organization was formed where initially only men could join, but now men or women can join and learn about the esoteric traditions as part of a curriculum. Because prior to that, it was always an oral tradition, or only one teacher and one student. So then we have theosophy, new thought, mind science, Christian Science, and now the whole genre of affirmations and law of attraction, books like The Secret. It's all part of this completely connected legacy that goes back as far as history goes. And all throughout it, you get the same idea again and again. Consciousness is fundamental in some way. Well, as a scientist, you're not taught that at all. You're taught within a worldview that's called materialism. Materialism, in one sentence, basically says that everything is made out of matter, including mind. Whereas the opposite, the esoteric traditions, are the opposite of that. It says everything is made out of mind, including matter. So a philosopher would call that idealism. So these are the two ways of perceiving the world, materialism and idealism. I decided that because it is so difficult within the materialistic scientific worldview to explain in a satisfactory way why magic and psychic phenomena, which are basically the same thing, why is it so difficult to explain as materialistic phenomenon? Maybe we should look at a different worldview, which is namely the esoteric worldview. So we're shifting from a materialistic frame to an idealistic frame and seeing whether these kinds of phenomena are easier to understand. And it turns out, of course, that they're very easy to understand because they're built from idealism, essentially. So I'm using philosophical terms here and ideas about worldviews and so on. And that is essentially what my book, Real Magic, is about. But I don't use that in the title, and I don't start with that because only 4 or 5 people would ever read the book. You do not want to put the word philosophy in the title of a book, and you don't want to start talking about it early on either. So a few academics will be interested, but nobody else will. So instead, I'm talking about an assumption of magic is an ancient practice, mostly superstition. Clearly, nobody in the right mind would believe in it today who goes through a standard Western education, and it basically has gone away. Well, it turns out that none of that is true. Magic never went away. There are plenty of academics who spend their careers studying magic, and there is science that can be brought to bear on the topic. So the book is written as a way as an introduction, actually, as to why we actually know now that some of these ancient practices were very likely to be real. And then I talk about some of the consequences of that, both for science and for daily practice.
That all sounds very fascinating to me. Can you go into some of like the core fundamentals of the research and how we would apply this stuff? Like, there's kind of 2 ways that I'm curious to go about it, because you have one kind of school of thought that's like the people looking to expand their consciousness. I've read plenty of books on psychic powers, intuition, all these different things to develop my consciousness. I went to, China to train with Shaolin monks because they could do things that were unbelievable, right? This isn't possible. So I don't know if I want to give it back to you and say, like, what do you believe is possible? And then how do we develop that connection? What are these like core principles that we can come back to? And then just, I guess, what is the nature of consciousness? Like, how does that begin? And how do we connect to this greater picture? I kind of threw a lot, but you can kind of pick and choose and what you think would be the most valuable out of that.
Yeah, that's a 4-hour discussion. Well, first of all, what is consciousness? By that I mean awareness. And in humans, at least, and probably a lot of other things, self-awareness, right? So nobody knows where awareness comes from. The assumption in the neurosciences is that the brain somehow generates something that we experience as self-awareness. There's actually no evidence that that is the case. It's an assumption. And for every piece of evidence which is based on neural correlates of consciousness and mind, like cognition, these are correlations. It doesn't say which direction the arrow of causation goes. In fact, there may be no arrow of causation. It may simply be a correlation. So it is so ingrained in a scientific sense that brain must be giving rise, because after all, the scientific perspective is everything's made out of matter or energy. And so consciousness must be made out of that as well. But as I said, there is no agreement in science, in any discipline or in philosophy, on where does consciousness come from. So you switch hats now and say, from an esoteric tradition, the assumption is that at the base of everything that we know, all there is consciousness. And it actually even makes sense from a personal perspective, because the only thing that we could ever know about anything is because of our awareness. From that perspective, everything else, including what you see out in the world, what we think we know about science, our theories, everything is an inference. It's an inference that we're making based on our awareness. If no one was aware at all, had no awareness, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because we think that it's something about being aware is necessary in order to be in the world. So there's no world if no one is aware. So from that first person perspective, idealism begins to make more and more sense. One of the critiques about idealism is that it could devolve into solipsism quickly. Solipsism is the notion that the only thing that exists is you. Because as I said, if your awareness is the only thing that you can know, then even other people become an inference. I can't tell if you're conscious or not. Looks like you are, but maybe you're a fancy program machine that it's like talking to Alexa or something. You know, we can't tell. And this is, of course, a long-term problem. But we can infer, at least, that other people seem to have the same experiences that we do, in which case consciousness seems to be shared by all kinds of things, not just people, animals, maybe even inanimate objects might have some form of consciousness. So if that is the case, and the esoteric traditions say that consciousness is not human-centric, it's simply part of the fabric of reality. You imagine reality is sort of a tapestry. It's clearly made up of material stuff, and energy is a real thing. We're not saying these are illusions, but at the same time, this seems to be woven into the same fabric as consciousness. So what I just described would be described more as neutral monism, because that from that perspective, it's saying that consciousness is very real, material stuff is very real, they coexist in some way. So it's the monism says that they're really not two separate things, but they appear to be two separate things, like two sides of the same coin. So that's a flavor of idealism. The esoteric traditions actually go farther than that and say that, yes, consciousness and the material world are related, but the material world emerges out of consciousness. In other words, one really is more fundamental. In that model, suddenly, to address your question, what's possible? Anything you can imagine is possible. And in some respects, that's what the magical traditions say. It's like literally anything that you can imagine is possible. Things that you cannot imagine probably won't happen, which addresses the issue of skeptics today, or someone who goes through 25 years of education. They get a narrow constraint of what they can imagine is possible. So if a physicist says that ESP is impossible, and they really believe that, for them, it won't happen, because they've now excluded it from the realm of possibilities. And yet, if the physical world emerges out of awareness, and we're talking now about a universal awareness, it's simply everywhere, and it's not even, it's before space and time, that everywhere awareness is what traditionally is called God. It's called universal consciousness, source, a million names for the same concept. Well, that source is somehow giving rise to or emerging from is the universe as we see it as humans. But our sense of awareness inside our head is made out of the same stuff. Like everything's made out of the same stuff, but our sense of internal experience is the universal consciousness. So in Hinduism, it's Atman equals Brahman. Every religion has the same concept, and all mystics keep saying this again and again. You are the universe. From an everyday perspective, that sounds crazy. What do you mean you are the universe? Well, the you is your awareness is the same as universal awareness. That means that each of us has, in effect, a very tiny piece of the same source that gave rise to the entire universe. So if you wish, you can make anything happen to a limited extent. Probably not going to be able to create an entire universe, but you can manipulate your world. So law of attraction, affirmations, all of that stuff, which is now pretty popular, I think from a theoretical or a philosophical basis, there's reason to believe that that's a real thing. It's not massive, it's not a hugely powerful thing, but it is real. You can push the world in small ways. More importantly, that if you take a purely scientific perspective and you want to know, well, is it really true that your awareness transcends space and time? And is it really true that your awareness can somehow shape reality around you? Those are experiments that can be done and have been done for about 150 years. And we know that it happens. It's small effects, but it's real. So one of the ways that I deal with this in my book, Real Magic, is not to go through all of these experiments again and describe how they work and so on. I do a summary of that, but I point people to my earlier books. Because in the earlier books, I do go in some detail and describe how the experiments are done, how we know that they're correct, how we know what the results are, and so on. I didn't want to repeat that. So instead, I give a summary, and then I quote the president of the American Statistical Association, because statistics is the discipline of somewhere between science and mathematics that evaluates data and makes an assessment about the data. So what did the president of the American Statistical Association say in 2016 for her presidential address? It was Jessica Utz, who was the president at that time. So she gave an hour-long speech about lots of different things in statistics, and then I'm sure from the audience's point of view, out of the blue, she starts talking about one of the applications of statistics that she was involved in, which was analysis of the US government program on remote viewing and precognition. And she says flat out that by the same standards that would be applied to any other area of science, that precognition and other psychic phenomena are real. Well, basically that's the end of the argument. You don't, if the president of the American Statistical Association is saying this to 6,000 statisticians because she has actually spent the time to look at the data, there's no argument to that. From an empirical perspective, these phenomena exist. And of course, I add other stuff too, but that's like game over as far as that kind of, about the existential question. So this then pretty much settles the notion about the existence of psychic phenomena. The link then to magic is twofold. One is that magic gives us a cosmology or a philosophy as to why it works. And if you look at what magic actually is in terms of the practices, one practice is divination, which means to perceive through space and time. That's been tested in the lab. We know it's true. The second is force of will, which is use of intention to push the world around. That's been tested in the lab. We know it's true. The third practice is theurgy, which is conjuring spirits or communicating with spirits to get them to do things on your behalf. There, the evidence is less certain that there are spirits. The evidence is certain that mediums, at least, mediums are psychics who talk to dead people, or at least they claim to talk to dead people. We can confirm that what the mediums get as information is correct. And it's in double-blind conditions, so they're not getting it through cold reading and other techniques. So what mediums can get about departed loved ones, the information is correct. We don't know where that information comes from. Maybe it's telepathy, maybe it's precognition, maybe it's something, and maybe there are no deceased people that they're speaking to. That's their experience, but we have no independent way of checking if that's what's actually going on. The same goes for near-death experiences. People have all kinds of wild and even consistent experiences, but we don't have an independent way of testing that yet to find out, is the experience exactly what it appears to be? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So at least two of the practices of magic have been confirmed in the lab. Third practice in theurgy, we don't know quite yet. That's the link then between what we can say with confidence from a scientific perspective and these ancient traditions. So the other thing interesting about magic is, if you go back maybe 500 or 1,000 years ago, nobody understood anything about anything. This is why in pre-scientific days, we had stories. We had cosmology stories, origin stories, stories about how things work. They usually involve spirits of this and that and whatever. We didn't know. Eventually, somebody figured out that there are certain regularities. natural regularities that didn't seem to require the intervention of gods, things like magnetism. And so you could use magnetism, and somehow if you float a tiny magnet on a piece of water, that it would always point in the same direction. So people can figure this out. Maybe spirits were doing it, but you didn't really need that idea anymore. By the same token, it was found that certain herbs would relieve a headache. Certain herbs would accelerate healing. Maybe it's because of some kind of spirit inside the material, but even that after a while wasn't thought to be necessary. You just eat this berry and your headache goes away. So that was called then transition from supernatural magical ideas to natural magic. Natural magic quickly led into alchemy, astrology, and herbalism, which are now known as chemistry, astronomy, and the pharmaceutical business. So all of science can be traced backwards in time into natural magic and then into supernatural magic. But when science developed, it left out something. It left out the role of consciousness, because alchemy, astrology, and herbalism all were very deeply related to consciousness of the practitioner. So the reason I mention this is because what I'm proposing then is that eventually we will rediscover what the ancients knew, which was that consciousness is way more important than we currently think, and it will come back into science. It'll be understood in different terms, different words will be used to talk about it, and it will revolutionize what we currently think about the scientific worldview. So that could happen next Tuesday. It's more likely to happen about a century from next Tuesday because science moves slowly. And then there are gigantic consequences in terms of how civilization is going to work, because our civilization pretty much is resting on a scientific worldview today. There are certainly religious people and religious countries where that's less true, but from a world economic perspective, we're pretty much sitting in the scientific worldview today. So as that worldview changes, the nature of civilization itself will change. So that's my riff on that. I don't know how much of your questions I addressed, but that's...
No, you covered them. Yeah, it's wonderful. So as you were talking, I was just writing down more questions. I think the worldview point is so important. And if you find fundamentally, especially in the scientific community, when I went to Egypt with Nassim Haramein and the Resident Science Foundation, they talked about worldviews. And for me, coming from a more, let's say, martial arts, spiritual background or whatever, it was always in, but science didn't kind of match that at the time growing up. So it's nice to see that shift. So I have a lot of questions, and I guess I'll just throw a lot of things at, and you can pick again.
One at a time.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of talk now about either artificial intelligence, simulation theory. We talk a little bit about God and source in the spiritual community, or even what you're looking at, ESP. We want to connect. We want to figure out, I want to know, how can I remote view? What is possible for me? And so I guess the question that you can kind of pick from is, what tools have you discovered that we can develop this connection so it can become real for us? Because that's the thing that we know through our consciousness, what we experience. And what of your research has kind of tied into, or discoveries made in the effects of artificial intelligence or simulation theory, or basically the big questions? What is this reality? What's going on here? What's the point? How do we have a life where we can influence our reality? And I think in spirituality, it's kind of twofold, where you learn a perspective where you can go through life peacefully and with a state of peace and calm, and a lot of that's in the mind. And then the second part is influencing your reality in a positive manner so that you're taken care of, but you have a positive influence.
All very good questions.
So you can pick
way
what you
too
want.
much.
That's why you can pick the one that you want. That's why.
All right. So you're asking about methods first. What do you do? Well, the first thing about methods is to realize that people are different. Like big whoop. That's like basic psychology. Because people are different, you have a very wide range of natural talent, just like you have in music and in sports. Some people have it, some people don't. If you are not talented in this domain, and I'm talking about ability to reach deep mind, you're not going to have much magic happening, because that's where it comes from. It comes from a very deep sense of not mind so much, but think of mind as a mental apparatus that allows you to do mathematics and talk and things like that, cognition. So that's part of it. But as you learn, especially through meditation and with some psychedelics, that you're creating the universe all the time. You're constructing what you see, what you think, and so on. Meditation allows you to drop lower than that and to start living in just awareness, only awareness. And you can go down as far as you can imagine. Some people are talented in that domain. So they'll take like a meditation class, and 2 weeks later they're in Samadhi. Or a magician would say they're in a state of gnosis. That's where you want to be, to have very strong abilities in this sense. Samadhi, of course, is the Sanskrit term used mostly in yoga, but that's where the yogic powers come from. And gnosis is exactly the same thing, but in a Western esoteric tradition, and that's where magic comes from. It doesn't happen at the surface level of the mind. It's happened at much deeper, normally thought of as unconscious levels of the mind, because that's where you connect. That's where you begin to realize that your consciousness and universal consciousness are the same thing. So what methods can the average person use? Well, meditation is probably the safest and the most ancient method. It works for some people, and others it simply doesn't work so well. There are many methods of meditation. For me, I do the practice of vipassana. In the modern day, we now call it mindfulness meditation. It's basically the same thing. For some people, it works really well. Other people would like a mantra-type meditation, or a concentration-type meditation, or walking meditation. Lots of different methods are used, or chanting, or whatever. All of them are useful in basically pulling you out of the ordinary state of awareness. Your everyday state of awareness is not the place you want to do magic, not the place you want to be psychic. It's not there. So that automatically will exclude a large proportion of the population, because you don't have the time or the interest or the talent to be able to want to go to deeper levels of mind. There are some within religious communities who don't believe that there is an unconscious mind. I mean, it's just they have been taught that, no, there is no unconscious. Well, they're wrong. It's easy to demonstrate that they're wrong, but nevertheless, that's what they believe. So that becomes a limitation for them. In terms of the simulation hypothesis and AI and so on, my guess is that if we're working from a model where everything is emerging out of consciousness, and consciousness comes before space and time, well, then that explains why psychic phenomena work and why magic works. But it also does something which is a little bit more unexpected. And it says that everything, including an artificial brain, has elements of consciousness in it because it's made out of consciousness. That the physicality which is used to make this material object is emerging out of consciousness in exactly the same way that an electronic circuit is ultimately emerging, or at least has atoms in it, and it has elementary particles, and it has electrons, and it has protons, and so on. It's made out of elementary stuff, just like everything else above it is too. So if we're made out of consciousness atoms, for want of a better term, we're made out of bits of consciousness, that means that everything has a certain degree of sentience to it. That would include an artificial brain. If the artificial brain is complex enough, if it starts to approach the complexity of the human brain, I would predict then that if the consciousness hypothesis is true, which I think it is, then that brain will become self-aware because it's made out of consciousness. It has all the kind of recursive circuitry that the human brain has, which will allow it to become aware of itself. In which case, the robots become sufficiently complex, they will wake up one day and start asking, well, who am I? And how did I get here? The same kind of questions that we would when the brain is working correctly. So if that is true, that the robots will become conscious, it is different than the usual singularity hypothesis. Because the singularity hypothesis is saying that the reason that the robots become conscious is because they have simulated the brain so well that it's giving rise to consciousness. The activity of the brain is giving rise to consciousness, just as a neuroscientist would say the brain is giving rise to consciousness. I'm saying, no, it will become conscious, but not because it's giving rise to anything. It's simply that it is able to accommodate the consciousness which is already there in a way which simulates the way that we do. So we are aware because the consciousness that we are part of can achieve self-awareness. It's not simply that you're aware, but it's the self-awareness that makes us human. Because otherwise you could have a thermostat, which would say, well, it's aware, kind of, it's responding to the environment, but it probably doesn't have self-awareness. It's not complex enough to do that. So this says that the conscious robots may end up instantly being super psychic, because depending on how we design them, they may not have this, they don't need the psychological filters that have been built into us by millions of years of evolution. So we as organisms, to survive, we have to pay a lot of attention to here and now. So the tiger next to us doesn't eat us. We need to pay very close attention to that. And you can then see how over a long period of time that our attention is shaped by evolution to be very narrow, here now. And that's basically it. Whereas the whole thing about being psychic is that you expand here and now to there and then. That's basically what happens with psychic perception, that you don't need to be focused here, you can spread it out. So if you want to see what's on Pluto a million years ago, that's just as easy as looking at what is in front of you from a psychic perspective, because that's what consciousness does. It's not located anywhere in space or time. So you can see anything, anywhere, anytime. So the robots may have that ability. If they do have such perceptual ability, then they may also have what might be thought of as an active ability as well. Their force of will may be much, much more powerful than it is in the typical human, in which case they will be psychic levitating wizards. And so if we're afraid about the singularity because of the Terminator movie scenario where they decide that we are bugs and we must be eliminated, what happens when the robots are not simply machines out to get us like autonomous drones, killer drones, but robots that could think us out of existence if they wanted to? So yet another reason to be afraid of the singularity. Fortunately, there are a lot of people now working on injecting ethics and morality into AI, and even love into AI, so that when at the point when the machines become aware, they will at least embody some aspects of compassion and what we would hope to see in the most enlightened humans. And then we would not be afraid of our robot overlords, which in principle might be way more powerful than we can even think of today.
Oh my God. What did you say? Psychic levitating wizard robots.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I talk about that as one of the consequences of all of this in the last chapter in the book.
Holy crap. Well, I want to be a psychic levitating wizard man.
Well, that is possible too. You may have the talent to do it. I mean, it's unusual to have that level of talent, but somebody has it, and you clearly you're on the path to figure it out. So yeah, there are some real people like that. In fact, I spent a chapter in the book talking about real life Merlins. They're rare. They're maybe 1 in a million or even 1 in 100 million people who are that level. But there are a number of well-documented cases in history where we're talking about hundreds to thousands of witnesses talking about humans levitating, humans calling down lightning bolts, big, big things. I talk about that in the book because this is after the chapter where I talk about the science of what we know from laboratory studies. What we see in the laboratory is usually pretty weak, but that's because we almost never have the opportunity to talk to these 1 in a million people. They're rare and they don't want to come to the laboratory. Occasionally, we find somebody who is an expert in clairvoyance, remote viewing. They're much more frequently found than people who can do macroscopic psychokinetic effects. So my guess is that maybe 1 in 10,000 people can reach the level of an expert for remote viewing, as compared to maybe 1 in a million or 1 in 100 million for people who can do psychokinetic effects. So since they're more common, we've had people in the laboratory and we can get much better results for perceptual tasks than we can for psychokinetic tasks. So maybe you can do both. And when you get to the point where you can levitate, will you then call me so we can study it in the lab?
100%. And if you figure out a way to, what's science, like do the process, I'll follow the process and I'll give it a shot. You know, that's kind of, I like to dive in, try the crap out of it, see what I'm able to do.
Okay, so you can find a recipe for what to do in the Yoga Sutras.
Oh, right.
Because the third book, or is it the second book? The third book of the Yoga Sutras is all about the siddhis, the yogic powers that arise as a result of dedicated meditation. The recipes are roughly 25 different kinds of powers that can be developed, one of which is levitation, another is invisibility, another is super strength, super speed, all the comic book things you've ever heard about, but this was written 2,000 years before comic books were invented. So the recipes basically follow the assumption, again, that at deep levels of awareness, what a yogi would call samadhi, that you're not that different from the same source of the universe itself. So the recipes all follow the same general idea, that if you want to be able to levitate, you need to contemplate, in samadhi, contemplate on the notion of weight and gravity. And if you can become weight or gravity, which happens at the mystical stage, there's no distinction between you and it anymore. If you can become it, well, then you can overcome it as well. You can be gravity, in which case, normally gravity is pointing in one direction. Simply decide, well, it's not going to affect me now, or I'm going to point it in the other direction. By the same token, one of the first and most elementary siddhis is perception through space and time. That's the very first one that Patanjali mentions. And so the way you do it is, the prescription is first you go to samadhi. And by the way, you have to be able to get to samadhi and sustain it for as long as you wish. I've been meditating for 40 years, and I think I can count maybe 4 minutes of spontaneously being in samadhi, but I can't make it happen at will. So I clearly don't have that talent. But if you do have the talent, you go there, you hang out in samadhi for as long as you wish. Then you direct a very small amount of intention toward the thing that you want to be. So in this case, for perception through space and time, you would concentrate on the notion of causality, or the apparent flow of time. You become it by putting all of your attention on it in a samadhi state. And then you can realize that causation is an appearance. It's not actually what's going on. That allows you to perceive past, present, and future all at the same time. Well, that's clairvoyance, basically, but at a very high and refined level, and not that difficult to achieve.
Oh, man. Okay. All right. So many things I want to throw back. Okay. So we've got the autobiography of a yogi, which I'm sure you've read. So yep. He does some pretty incredible things in that book, that Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. People are just, they're disappearing, reappearing, healing, doing all these different things.
Right.
So I was watching something, a guy with Greg Braden, about this yogi that put his hand in a wall in a cave or something and pushed through the cave. So these things that are seemingly unbelievable, through your research as a scientist, PhD, with all the accolades, you believe this is true. And then, I'll get some of it maybe.
I would say that the extreme level, these really incredible things, we don't have the same level of confidence that we have for something we can test in the lab, because the stories about invisibility and levitation and so on, they are still stories, right? They're anecdotes, sometimes by credible people. There's sometimes lots of witnesses. So it has some credibility, but it's very different than the kind of credibility we can get when we do something in the lab and other scientists can repeat it in the lab. So I would say I'm inclined to suspect that some of it is real. Some of the major stories are real, but not with the same level of confidence.
Gotcha. Cool. I appreciate that, the distinction. So yeah, the possibility, because like you said before, if we don't give ourselves the possibility, it can never happen. And that's kind of one of the things that I'll teach pretty consistently. If you can't imagine doing it, a life for yourself or whatever, how do we apply these things? How can we open up our restraints that we're putting on ourselves, or we got from cultural programming, or from the way it is that's limiting, or not even understanding it? And so I'm curious from your view, do you...
let me respond to that before you go on. So how do you get somebody to open their range of possibilities? Some people are just naturally open. It's a personality trait. That, like, I have taken lots of personality tests, and I have a trait which is called openness, which is very high on the scale. I'm just open to all kinds of things. Maybe it's because I had a career in music and engineering and psychology and a bunch of other things. So I just have a wide variety of ways of seeing the world. Other people are much more narrow in terms of what they will accept as true. They're typically called skeptics. And there's nothing wrong with skepticism. It simply is a matter of doubt. But some people carry it to extremes, and they really do not accept certain things at all. For those people, the only thing that can cause them to increase their imagination a little bit is a personal experience. That is the only thing. They will not accept any other form of evidence. And as I talk about in the book on magic, even one of those people who has a personal experience, they will forget it, or they will deny it afterwards, because it can completely shatter your belief system. Your belief system, we identify with our beliefs. So if something happens which is to somebody, it's just mind-boggling, it's uncomfortable. And so they will deny it later. They'll say it never happened, or it was a mistake, or something like that. And I give examples in the book of where strong skeptics had some astonishing experience, and then a couple of years later, they just completely deny it. So if a person is not particularly open, they have what I call an imagination deficiency syndrome. They are limited in terms of what they can perceive. In general, creative artists, writers, musicians, anybody who's involved in a creative either profession or hobby or whatever, they're usually way more open to these kinds of phenomena than somebody who stereotype is someone who spends an enormous amount of attention on just one thing or just a few things, and that's it. So how do you get somebody to pay attention to this? If they have an inclination towards it, it's relatively easy. Like they read a book, they do experiments on themselves, they learn to meditate, whatever. Yeah, they can be opened up. Some percentage of people, maybe 20%, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yep. I believe in the direct experience very much so. And that's why, if there's processes and stuff like meditation, just try it and see what it's like, and then know for yourself. So I think that's really good feedback. What I'm curious
and for others, by the way, the only thing that might work is a psychedelic, right? Yep. The psychedelics are described sometimes as breaking open the head. It shoves you into a new space. For some people, that could be the only way to do it as well. Because then, if they wanted to, they could repeat it. You see, the problem with a spontaneous major psychic thing is that it may not be repeated, so it's easier to deny. Whereas if you took LSD or took psilocybin or something, you could have a very profound experience that you can repeat, in which case you either go crazy because you're denying your own experience, or you accept it. So people have done both. People go psychotic sometimes because they simply can't accept it, or that they do accept it.
Yep. Yeah, that's true right there too, because there's lots of amazing research being done now on psychedelics, and I'm an advocate for responsible use. If you want to explore that, with maybe not go too much, but there's a lot of, it changes the way you think in a way that you can't imagine. It takes you to a whole different state of consciousness. And ideally it inspires you to open up doors of your own possibility.
Right.
And that's what it's, people have limitations. And I feel like culture, we try to impose those limitations. And I think we should be looking at what is possible for ourselves and encouraging others. And I think that psychedelics are a pretty good way to quickly and directly, see a worldview and question yourself, question your own possibility and limitations. One of the questions that I really wanted to ask before I let you go, because this has been so good, two things. One of them is a kind of a deeper thing, and one of them is just general knowledge. And so be basic with the first one. What beliefs or worldviews would you empower each individual with to make the most amount of positive change on the planet? And then the second one, and you can kind of pick and choose again as you wish in this, in your research, you've looked at Eastern mysticism, religions, Western religions, mysticisms, and it's usually this connection with God, nature, source. We're in this reality now. We go on YouTube and you've got aliens and archons and demons and spirits and fifth dimension and ninth dimension and all this shit. It's very fascinating. And I'm right in the middle of it, and I'm curious, and you're curious too. You're trying to measure this stuff, however the heck you're doing that. So kudos and good luck. That sounds challenging. What do you think this reality is, and what's important to know about it? Of all that stuff? Do you believe we're in an awakening? What's the connection with God? What is that to you? And that's kind of general. So I'll leave it with that.
Again,
I just gave you a cluster to kind of sort through.
Yeah, what is reality? And how should we behave? I have mixed feelings about this. That one might think that if we believed that we live in a universe that is created from consciousness, or for some source that we find difficult to imagine, and that we are part of that, that at least it suggests that maybe some human-centric notions about compassion, about altruism, about the golden rule, all of that, maybe that's also built into the fabric of the universe. From a magical perspective, it definitely is, because from a magical perspective, everything is interconnected. It's all emerging out of this one thing, this consciousness thing. So the reason why black magic is discouraged, even though it's also immensely seductive, is because you do something bad to somebody else, you're hurting yourself, either immediately or it will come back later. You can't avoid that. You can't manipulate the world without manipulating yourself, because it's the same stuff. The reason, by the way, that black magic is seductive is because, as Jean-Paul Sartre once said, the philosopher, hell is other people, right? As social creatures, we have to rely on other people to get things done. And if they don't do what you want them to do, well, that's hell. So hell is other people. And so we're almost always inclined to try to influence another person to do something to our benefit. Well, that overrides their free will. That's black magic. Anything which overrides somebody else's free will is black magic, and considered a no-no in virtually every magical tradition, although there are flavors of magicians who specialize in it because they don't care. That maybe they're masochists or something and they don't care. So the reason why I've conflicted about everyone suddenly becoming all spiritual and believing in consciousness and all the rest is because there have been societies in history, and even today to some extent, that are much more spiritual. But it seems almost impossible for humans to gain a sense of spirituality without immediately collapsing into a religion, in the sense of an organized cosmology which paints a story about how we should understand the spiritual experience. Because of that, even supposedly highly secular societies, highly spiritual societies, they all end up with the same nasty business. That power usually is the thing that corrupts the society. So just as one example, you can go to a place like India, where lots of people are very interested in all kinds of spiritual things, and they're at each other's throats all the time. They have caste systems. They have many reasons that are not working too well for a country of over 1 billion people. So what does that mean now if we have a world of 8 billion people, and pretty soon, where we're all very spiritual, but we all have power issues too. And not only that, some people will be highly talented and will be able to, even within a spiritual umbrella, be much more powerful naturally, that they will immediately attract cults, right? Somebody who's just even mildly telepathic can easily create a cult around themselves because they can portray what appears to be godlike powers. Most people don't have that, so they're going to follow this person. And there are probably tens of thousands of existing cults around the world that are led by people who have some minimum of talent, usually some minimum psychic talent. We might think of them as charismatic, but a charisma, a charism in the Catholic faith is a psychic power. It's a special power. It's in the psychic, in Catholicism, it's not thought of as psychic, it's thought of more as a divine gift. But essentially, it is a yogi might think of it as a type of siddhi, a certain power, in which you can radiate goodness, and that attracts people to you. Or you can radiate attraction, which will attract people to you, and so on. There are lots of powers like that where they're somewhere between the Jedi mind trick, where you can cloud people's minds, but you can cloud it in ways that you wish. You can cloud it so that now you're the most attractive person in the world, or the most powerful, or whatever you want. You will draw people to you, and that is seductive. So until we can evolve out of what amounts to our humanity adolescence, where power becomes so important, I'm not sure that a major change in our worldview would make us necessarily better people. What it will do is change technologies and make them way more powerful than what we currently have, which means that part of what I do then in studying psychic phenomena and magic is the same that somebody would be doing by studying nuclear energy. The phenomena itself is really interesting, but it has very important ethical considerations as well. Like some things you don't want to be made public because it would be too dangerous to be made public. We're not mature enough yet as a species. And if you unleash these kinds of ideas among as I say in the book, basically a group of babies, that's not going to be good for anybody. So I'm well aware of this. We, among my colleagues, we talk about this occasionally on what do we make publicly available and what don't we do. At this point, I don't think we actually know enough to know what the unintended consequences will be for revealing this, but I think we don't have to worry about it too much because the vast majority of people don't have the passion and talent to be able to use these phenomena very well. Some do, and some can learn it. But most people are more concerned about the World Cup soccer and the latest NASCAR race and so on, which is fine. So they're not going to be involved in doing magic. They're not going to be able to harm reality. So what is reality? Well, my guess is, and of course, who knows what reality can really be, but my guess is that it has something to do very importantly with the nature of consciousness. So awareness just seems to be part of the fabric of everything. Consciousness can embody in many different ways. So it probably, if in fact from consciousness emerges the physical world, well, we're physical creatures. We are emerged from consciousness over a long period of time from our perspective. Maybe from consciousness's perspective, it was a flash. It's like, oh, I think I'll dream up humans. Bang. 100 million years later, there you got it. From our perspective. From its perspective, it's instant. So I think that's my current working model for what I think reality is. I was drawn to this notion. Like as I started to say early on, I have no religious background. I was taught not as an atheist, but as a-religious, which is quite different. A-religious means that the notion of religion is just never a topic. It never came up. We never discussed it. It didn't exist. It's like it was an unnecessary idea. An atheist then is someone who is who is anti-believing in theism, believing in gods. And that wasn't the case. I'm completely agnostic about it. I think it would be interesting if there were godlike things out there. I don't mind if that's true or not. But by not having a religious background, then I've been drawn basically by the research that I've been doing, by reading the literature, to accept at least what most mystics have said about the nature of reality. Some religions then codify the mystical experience in various ways, largely shaped by culture. And I see those as interesting stories. They're cosmologies. I don't really buy into any religious doctrine. But the mystical state, it's a repetitive experience that people have talked about forever. That is probably as close to the truth as we can get. And that truth says, ultimately, we are the universe, as strange as that sounds. But I think that's the way it is, that we are an embodiment of the ultimate reality. That's what gives us so much responsibility too, right? We're a little piece of the universe. Well, look out into what the stars are doing. They're bashing into each other. They're blowing up. They're doing all kinds of violent things. Maybe that's why we behave the way we do too. We're acting out on a microscopic scale what's happening in the macroscopic. I don't know.
Incredible. That's such a fascinating, wonderful answer. I really appreciate your time and coming on and all the research that you've done and sharing. I wish I could have you all day. Is there anything that you want to, that was wonderful. You could leave it at that. Just tell people where they could find you, but anything that you want to leave the listeners with, and just thank you so much for coming on.
Well, so you can go get Real Magic.
It's a great cover, by the way.
Yeah, they did a good job. It's the artists at Penguin Random House did that. So yeah, you go to deanradin.org or realmagicbook.com. You get a lot of more information about the book itself. You can get it in paperback, in ebook form, and in the Audible audiobook form. It's actually selling about the same number of paperback books as the audio book. In the audio book, I had the opportunity to choose who the voice artist would be. And I chose the guy who reads most of the Dan Brown books. And I chose him because this is the kind of artist who could read anything, including a menu or the phone book, and you would just be pleased to listen because the voice is that good. Some people have asked me, well, why didn't I read it? And so my response to that is, you got to be kidding. You really want to listen to this voice for 12 hours because that's how long the book is? So I decided, no, I don't think so. I want somebody who is a professional reader and knows how to do it right. So there you have it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your work and everything you're up to. Keep me up to date with your research, and the second that I can levitate or do something, I'll be coming down your way to show you what's possible. But thanks for coming on, and thanks everybody for listening. Bye.
Live long and prosper.